Madam Speaker.
Let me begin by quoting a former colleague of mine. Ukraine is defending itself against unjustified aggression, the Kremlin's naked attempt to destroy a country's statehood, infrastructure, and identity. Full collective support for Ukraine's victory is the right, legal, moral, military, and strategic course of action. I strongly support this position. Putin's war of aggression is not just against Ukraine. His war machine attempts to undermine the Western consensus for democracy, the rule of law, and the pursuit of equality of opportunity. And so, now to Canada's role in this fight and the substance of this bill. This bill proposes updates to Canada's existing free trade agreement with Ukraine. I support free trade with Ukraine. I do not support every measure in this bill, and I take particular issue with the Liberals' inclusion of a carbon tax within the text. And that is because in the Canadian context, the Liberal carbon tax has dramatically increased the cost of living for every single one of the people I represent, all while failing to bring Canada anywhere close to meeting its emissions targets. It's not solving the urgent question of climate change. It is a clearly flawed policy that creates economic harm, and those who adhere to its ideology without questions put up roadblocks that have stifled the policy innovation needed to reduce emissions. I can simultaneously hold the position that I support free trade with Ukraine, I support the victory of Ukraine over Putin, and oppose a carbon tax. There are tens of millions of other Canadians who feel the exact same way. For the Liberals or the NDP or the Bloc or anyone else to suggest that to develop ways for Canada to support Ukraine, that I have to capitulate on my position on a carbon tax, misses the point of democracy, which is what we are ostensibly trying to fight for. In a dire crisis situation such as the one Ukraine finds itself in, fighting against the war of aggression being waged by Putin, it is the Liberal government that should have been working collaboratively to find a unified path forward. If they are unwilling to budge on the inclusion of a carbon tax in this agreement, then the onus was on them to build consensus with the Canadian public and acknowledge that we can have internal differences on a carbon tax while supporting Ukraine. It is a dangerous, deadly game for the Prime Minister of Canada and anyone in this place to repeatedly suggest that if a Canadian opposes a carbon tax, they must support Putin. This is a disgusting, morally bankrupt, and fundamentally anti-democratic, politically motivated aspersion that serves only to divide our country at a time when it desperately needs leadership that unifies it. It does not help Ukraine. It does not help Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. If the Prime Minister eschewed that approach, the Prime Minister eschewed this approach when he failed to table this agreement in Parliament 90 calendar days prior to the commencement of negotiations. In February of 2020, ahead of the renegotiation of the CUSMA agreement, the Minister at the time made the following commitment: to require that a notice of intent to enter into negotiation towards a new free trade agreement be tabled in the House of Commons at least 90 calendar days prior to the commencement of negotiations. That didn't happen in this case. There was no collaborative effort. And again, I want to reemphasize that I will oppose the Liberal carbon tax. It does not help my constituents. It is not reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It is not meeting emissions targets. It is a flawed and failed policy. I will simultaneously stand here and support Putin while saying that anybody who is suggesting that we should be making politics over this is actually helping Putin. When I listen to this line of attack, it disgusts me because I know the people who are saying these things know better. And if they want to earn the votes of Canadians, they should be looking at the issues that are pushing their polls so far south, as opposed to desperately trying to cling to some sort of false narrative that only divides our country and only helps our country's enemies. It's disgusting, and it needs to stop. Seriously. Earlier today, the member for Glengarry Prescott Russell would not commit to asking his government to seize or to repurpose seized Russian assets. I'm not going to stand here and call him a Putin supporter. So no one on the other bench should suggest just because I firmly, strongly, backed by evidence, reject a carbon tax, that I somehow support that. That is exactly what the Russian war machine wants. That is the exact narrative that they want, and it needs to stop. At the same time, what this agreement should be doing is looking at ways to materially help our allies. Today, the leader of the Conservative Party, actually just moments ago, issued a press release saying that the Prime Minister must send CRV rockets to Ukraine. He's talking about ways that Canada should be sending surplus weapons to help our allies in their fight against Putin. That is a material way that we should be helping, not casting aspersions and trying to divide our country over this issue. The other thing that I want to, Madam Speaker, implore every member of this House as strongly as I can. I am going to read a small paragraph from a colleague in Ukraine, a note that she sent to me. The value of frozen Russian assets is estimated to be at least $320 billion. With no reasonable prospect for Russia paying compensation to Ukraine anytime soon, and Ukraine's need for both short and long-term financial assistance, confiscations of Russian assets becomes the only just and viable option, especially in view of the fact that up to $1 trillion will be needed for Ukraine to fully recover. Our partners, and this is from a Ukrainian MP, our partners' taxpayers should not shoulder the burden of Ukraine's recovery alone, especially as they froze and can use assets of aggressors responsible for the devastation. Madam Speaker, there are senior government officials in Ukraine today. Some of those senior government officials have suggested that in the past, that Canada's military is impotent. If they are going to take that posture, then at the very least, what Canada should be doing is using the laws that are already in place, that have already been supported by all members in this House, to repurpose seized Russian assets and lead a G7 charge to force Western allies to do exactly what Ukraine is crying out for in this case. Putin's roar of aggression they need to compensate Ukraine. They are the aggressor. And at the very least, if Canada is true, and if Canada is going to try and make any sort of case that we are actually some sort of broker in the world, that we have any sort of relevancy, this is low-hanging fruit. We should be the first country to be doing this. We have the legal mechanisms. There is nothing in this agreement about that. Absolutely nothing. The government they have had this tool at their disposal for 2 years now, and they haven't moved on this. Am I going to accuse the government of not supporting Ukraine because of that? I could. Instead, I'd rather that they just move on it. This is an issue that transcends petty partisan politics and the desperate attempt of a Prime Minister who is 16 points behind in the polls to try to cling onto a disgusting life raft for his political gain. We have to work together. Our global democracy is at stake, folks. Right now, our allies are fighting a war that, we have lost the plot here, honestly. If somebody stands up, Madam Speaker, and dares question the fact that I will stand up for my constituents against a policy that does nothing to help them, that does nothing to help climate change, I have watched this debate. I have watched pundits. I have watched former colleagues say, well, maybe the Conservatives should just capitulate on this. Absolutely not. It is the role of the government to build consensus during a time of crisis, and they failed to do that. So I beg them, do something that resembles work. Work with our partners to stop the funding of the Russian war machine by transporting more of Canada's natural gas overseas. That was that should have been in this agreement, but it's not. But at the very least, today, there's $300 billion. That's more than the entire sum total of all of the aid that's been sent to Ukraine. And Canada could be leading the charge on this. And instead, we have Liberal members of Parliament standing here and saying these things. They have lost the plot. They have lost the plot. And Canadians know this. Canadians aren't buying this. They're not buying this. So let's do better, Madam Speaker. I implore, I beg the government to rethink their posture, both on the carbon tax, on their political position on this issue, as well as dragging their feet on common sense measures that Conservatives have been calling for some time, that there's already consensus for in the House of Commons and across the country. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. In every trade agreement, there's all sorts of compromises that are made. Sometimes you agree with something, sometimes you disagree with something. You take a look at the overall agreement in itself, and let there be no doubt when the President of Ukraine comes to Canada to sign an agreement that there was a consensus that was there. Even individuals like Brian Mulroney, a progressive conservative, who had the Canada-US trade agreement. I'm sure that former Prime Minister, reflecting in terms of what the Conservative Party is today saying, is nothing but hogwash. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever outside of the MAGA conservative element coming from the United States into Canada that's actually driving the Conservative Party's position. This red herring that the members just finished talking about is wrong. It is about the MAGA right, Madam Speaker. My question is why will the Conservative Party not support this trade agreement?
Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Madam Speaker, standing up and using a loud, shouty voice does not negate the fact that the Liberals did not engage in a collaborative approach on this agreement. They did not table it in advance of the House of Commons. They did not try to seek consensus, and I oppose a carbon tax. A carbon tax, the Liberal carbon tax has brought Canada nowhere close to meeting its emissions targets. It's increasing the price of everything for everybody in our country at a time when most Canadians can't afford. They are choosing between food and rent. So yes, I oppose a carbon tax. Yes, I disagree with people, even of my own former political stripe, who suggest that we shouldn't. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm representing my constituents. I can do that and support strong action by Canada against the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Pierre-Boucher, les Patriotes.
The Honourable Member for Pierre-Boucher, les Patriotes Verchères. Ever since we started listening to the Conservatives on this bill, I've been struggling to follow. During the first version of the free trade agreement with Ukraine, the Conservatives brought it forward. And this new version is essentially just an update of the former version. There's nothing revolutionary in there. At a time when there's a war between Russia and Ukraine, so we might expect that all parliamentarians would show solidarity and say that it's time to support Ukraine in the face of the Russian invasion. It needs, even more than ever, to be able to trade with other countries. Now, the Conservatives love to oppose this on the basis of their infamous carbon tax. But if they were a government, would they really hold this kind of irresponsible remarks?
The Liberal carbon tax. It does not solve climate change, and it increases the cost of everything. And if the government wanted to to have a consensus-based approach on this agreement, they would have removed it. It is unnecessary. It does not need to be in there. It's in there to be a political wedge, and I will stand up for my constituents. Now, to my colleague opposite, he needs to go talk to his constituents. They do not support a carbon tax either. They do not want to see an increased cost of living because of it. They are not worth the cost. A carbon tax is not worth the cost. We should be supporting Ukraine with measures like the Conservative leader announced today by sending surplus weapons. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm not sure why the discussion, Madam Speaker, is focused on a carbon tax right now. When we're talking about this important issue, what I'm reflecting on is the conversations that I'm having with people who are arriving in my riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith fleeing war in Ukraine. A single mom and her child who are talking with me about the impacts of having to leave behind their families and all that they know in Ukraine. And I made a commitment to this now constituent to do all that I can to support Ukrainians at this time. And what I'm trying to understand is the leader of Ukraine asked for us to sign this agreement. I'm not going to pretend to know better than Ukrainians themselves and the leader of Ukraine how to best move forward. So why would we not support this agreement when the leader is asking us to do so?
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
The free trade agreement with Ukraine already exists. The NDP could be pressuring their coalition partners to release frozen assets to Ukraine. They're not doing that right now. That would immediately impact the people that she just talked about, but she should also be trying to lower the cost of living in Canada and fight for climate change by axing the carbon tax.